Live, Madam Chair.
Hello, folks. This is House Corrections and Institutions. It is Friday, February 17th. We're starting our work this morning on a bill that we have before us. It's House Bill 102. It deals with updating the statutes for the program of art and state buildings. We've taken some testimony on this from the Arts Council. We're waiting today to take some testimony from the partners in this program, which is the Department of Buildings and General Services Commissioner. She's running a little late, but I wanted to get started anyway. I just want to open this up. There's a few issues that we have to resolve in the bill, but I wanted to open up this time for thoughts from the committee members in terms of what their thinking is for the bill and any flags that we need to take some more testimony on or wordsmithing that we might be interested in. And when we get to the point of really drafting another draft, we'll need to bring in Becky to be with us so that she knows what we're talking about and can produce another draft. So we've got to have some preliminary conversations as a committee. So Michelle.
I am very supportive of the bill. The one thing that I would like to see amended that I can recall from when we discussed it before is that, as I understand it, historically the bill has excluded prisons from having eligibility for these projects. And I would like to have prisons be eligible. Not every type of art installation would be appropriate in a prison, but for example, a mural could be absolutely appropriate. And I believe that we should talk about that and consider modifying that aspect.
Does anyone object to that?
Let's hold on. This is part of a committee process here. So a person has recommended that we allow a facility that isn't normally allowed under current statute to participate in the art and state buildings. So the process for that would be to ask the respective folks like the Arts and State Buildings or the Arts Council how that would play out, to ask BGS how that would play out. And then from there, we as a committee would make a decision. Okay?
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Yeah.
Learning here.
So that's a thought. Other thoughts?
Well, we want to hear from DOC as to what their policy may be that's not allowing it.
Yeah.
I think that would be important.
That's a good point. Other thoughts? Tristan and then Troy?
I have one thought on that and then a separate thought. Is yours on the same topic? Or?
No.
Okay. So just on that, I think making sure we have I think there's some tension in sort of this being a capital project, capital funding, for there's a lot of art that can be really good for our spaces. It can be more passing, more not capital, not major. A mural like prisoners could do that. So I just want to think about how we put that in at a state level. My other comment on the bill was about basically the question of being able to sell memorabilia and sort of other merchandising options for the state to distribute the beauty of this art to people that aren't able to visit the buildings or the places in question, and to share that and to support them.
Are you talking about the arts collection that we have that's under state ownership in general? Or the art that's currently in our state buildings that we have paid for through our art and state buildings
program? If we're looking at the statute for this arts and state building program,
yeah.
And it talks about the duties of the commission or the council, I think it may be renaming that. The duties could include, but do not yet include, having to do with printing, selling, bringing in revenue from from sort of gift shop stuff. So I'm looking for a way to talk about that in the bill.
I'm a little confused here. Maybe you can clarify a little bit, Eric.
Eric Kilcorn, Universal Translator from
Yeah,
UPS.
thank you.
I think you're talking about merchandising products being developed on the intellectual property of what's in the collection. Is that sort of what you're saying? And I think there's precedent for that in the curator's office. I keep thinking of Series on a Stick. I know we weren't actually, no, we did. We sold chocolate in the shape series at one point.
Getting a little bit more organized about that and having that have statutory responsibilities that lie somewhere that money could flow back into the program.
But it's the arts collection, a much bigger piece than this little carve out that we have for the art and state buildings, correct, David? Is that what he's talking about?
Yes, I mean,
We have art collection in the State House.
Right, we have a variety of collections in our database. So we keep the catalog of all works of art that are owned by the state of Vermont, officially owned by the state of Vermont.
Yeah.
They break down in categories such as the State House has its own collection, but it includes works of art. For example, the piece over here by Tom Latham is a piece that it is physically in the State House right now, but it is a work of art that we consider to be part of the state art collection, which can be deployed to the State House, but it can also be deployed to other state facilities. So we move works of art around as needed in a certain collection. And then the art in state buildings collection is identified as a specific collection. And those works of art in many cases are not portable. Many of them, if we've done our work right, many of them are actually physically incorporated into the building itself. And that ensures that they are frankly not going to go anywhere else. They were made specifically for that facility, and that facility and its history and the history of the community at large are all factors that may have gone into the creation of that work. So on the other hand, there are art and state buildings works that are portable, that could move, and we took them on the road 15 years ago, I think, to celebrate the program and did art exhibitions in a variety of communities all over Vermont. We took it on tour. We took the whole collection on tour to make people more aware that we had these resources. I would agree with you, sir, that there always are opportunities for art to be made even more broadly available to people and certainly Series on a Stick is an example of a shrewd marketing ploy that we developed when we were celebrating the creation of the brand new statue on top of the dome. So
David, if we're looking what Tristan just mentioned, that this is beyond the Art and State Buildings program. It's a whole separate entity that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So right now for our arts collection, beyond the Art and State Buildings, is there, if there was to be a merchandising programming that we put in place, some form of merchandising, where would the dollars go? Is there a repository of do you have a fund? Where would it go?
In the case of Series on a Stick, that was a project of the Friends of the State House. So they're a private nonprofit organization, and yet they raise monies for our program. So it went into state coffers eventually to support programming here in the State House.
But you don't have a line item
No.
for arts collections statewide, for a statewide art collection?
Certainly not a revenue line.
Perhaps an expense line.
Yeah.
Right.
Because that's what would have to be addressed. If you're going to put in a merchandising program, you've got to figure out who's
Sure.
going to hold that
Yeah.
program, who's going to house the program, where the expenses and where the revenue is going to go in.
This is one of the
doesn't
reasons
exist.
we have nonprofit partners, right?
Okay.
There is flexibility with such partners and entities that the state itself would find it harder to do for that reason.
Michelle, could you
Yeah.
identify yourself for the
Yes.
record too, because we are on YouTube.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Michelle Bailey from the Vermont Arts Council. And I would just want to, if anything from the Art and State Buildings collection were to be part of some kind of merchandising, I know there's some language in the contract with the artist that around licensing that says that we may use it for educational or promotional of the program or whatever, but if it comes to sales, I'd have to dig deeper into that, but there may be a need to get permission from the artist or things like that. So we need to dig a little deeper into that and to see what that might mean for those things. I don't think it's impossible, but we want to be careful whatever we agree to in our contracts.
And you would want it cut.
That's what I was thinking.
No doubt,
That's what I was thinking.
rightfully so.
So we can vet that a little further. There's Troy. Is this part of the conversation for this, Wayne? Wayne?
Because what, I think you sort of like suggesting you could sell prints or something of these things. But then, of course, you get into the stuff, like you say, with the nonprofits doing it, otherwise if a state entity would sell it, now you gotta have employees to deal with this. All of a sudden, you got all kinds of costs involved in just selling something. And the question then becomes, do you make more money than it costs you? And that's a.
Nothing is simple on the state level.
It's like selling the stamps for canoes, right? When I did that assessment years ago, a couple of costs more to sell the stamps than we would ever get out of the stamps.
Back again.
So we can put that on the list and see if it's something we as a committee would want to explore, but it is beyond the scope of the Art and State Buildings program, just to put that out there. Troy?
Two things. First, Kristen, don't forget, don't let lose sight of making something out of carpeting.
The pocketbooks.
But more importantly, this is just a grammar thing, and I wasn't here for the previous testimony, so forgive me if we've already discussed this, but this is bottom of page 3, so line 21 on page 3, and then the first 3 lines, page 4. We're shifting the language there from shall transfer up to 50 grand to not less than 75,000. So we are setting a floor there, a very deliberate floor, and we don't have a ceiling. I personally am fine with spending all the money on art, but I want to anticipate Representative Donahue in position on the floor, so we should probably talk about that.
Boy.
Representative Donahue's position on the.
I would imagine she'll catch it if we don't.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. So that is a policy decision that we're going to have to make. That's some things I wanted to bring up, that we have some policy decisions to make here. Right now, it's may transfer, and it's changing that it's a shall. So for new members, may to shall is a big shift.
Yep.
May means you don't do it, you can do it, or you don't have to do it. Shall is you're required to do it. So right now, there may be a transfer of 50,000. It's a specific amount, or up to 50,000. Traditionally, we think of it as really 50,000. To the art acquisition fund. And we don't have a line item for that anymore. We used to, but we don't do that anymore because it kind of got incorporated within the project cost. And that's where it'd be good to have the commissioner here to see how that works through the process. So, that's what we'd have to figure out as a committee, changing the may to shall, changing the dollar amount from up to 50,000 to a floor being 75,000. You've got to do at least 75,000.
Right. Not less
And
than.
then we have to discuss, do you do this as a line item every year in the capital budget like we used to do? Or are we implying it's done within the project cost? Knowing that some money in that 100,000 or the 5 million that's going out for a construction piece of that's going to be for the arts piece. That's something we're going to have to talk about and maybe vet and clarify because it's really not clear. What the new language does say is that the commissioner would include in the capital budget a separate line item So that's the balance there. The other thing is that it's increasing the amount of that appropriation to cover some of the expenses of the council administering this program. Right now, it's 5,000 would be available, and the bill proposes that not more than 15%. And now they figure it's about 10%, because it's 5,000, 50,000. So that's what we have to consider.
And there's no ceiling, so.
And there's no ceiling.
10-15% is.
Higher,
Yeah.
right. So those are the moving pieces we have to talk about. The other thing we have to talk about is, I want to go back a little bit. The program right now only really talks about purchasing and installing to a certain extent. But some of the art that we do have out there is 25, 30 years old, and we're getting to the point of having to do some maintenance and conservation work. Should the Arts and State Buildings program pay for that? Or not? And if it doesn't, then how are we going to address that? So those are some of the flags out there for us to take testimony on, think about, talk about as a committee. Becky is here. When we have thoughts, when we want to go in a certain direction, Becky can draft the language to accommodate that. John?
I agree with your concept of the art that needs to be maintained, and there is wordage in here that the money can be used for maintenance. But I guess what I want to have clarified in my mind is, let's say it is 75,000, and next year it could be accumulated up to 150, 225. At what point does that cap? We only commission a building every few years. So do we cap it, or do we just let it accumulate, and at what point does it get swept and all of a sudden it disappears?
Yep. So that's a policy conversation. So flag that.
Yep. And one other thing, this is a different subject, there's no wordage in here. At some point, as you pointed out just a minute ago, that some of the art is getting old. That doesn't mean that it's still not pertinent, but what comes to my mind is there's been several murals not belonging to the state, but one in Burlington, one at Vermont Law School, one at Dartmouth, that became inappropriate, and whether or not there should be wordage in here on who makes the decision to decommission, do away with a piece of artwork.
See a hand raised.
I think it could be.
Yeah, you're going to be on the hot seat
I
anyway.
may be able to answer one of his first questions.
Okay, and then we need the testimony from you on the bill to begin with. So when
Yes.
is it most appropriate? Right now to answer the question?
Well, just about the funding piece and what secures that funding, if that would be helpful for everybody.
Okay, why don't you come on up to the seat,
Okay.
front seat, because you're going to,
Because I agree with you, it's tricky, but I think they did actually a good job addressing that in the bill with the proposal.
so why don't you just start on your normal testimony that you would do, and then we can, when it gets to that point, you can highlight that for us, respond to John's question.
Absolutely, Madam Chair. I'm going to try to pull up my notes that I sent to Eric the other day. So for the record, my name is Jennifer Fitch. I am the Commissioner of Buildings and General Services. Nice to see everybody today. I feel like I haven't been in the room that much this week. So overall, we are very supportive of this program. We think Art and State Buildings is amazing, it's great, and it does add so much characteristic, diversity, all sorts of things. So in general, we absolutely love this program and are extremely supportive of it at SEGS. I know David echoes that. So we are very supportive of this program. The component of the program in this that we are most supportive of and has been most challenging, and that's going to lead into the funding piece, is that oftentimes, right, in the past, it's always come out of an existing project. And when we estimate, when we're putting together estimates for construction, we're not considering whether or not this program will be selected for Art and State Buildings. So as I and Eric has testified to in the past, the way this generally works is we put together a capital bill request, It goes up to the administration, it gets a haircut, it comes to the legislature, and it takes another haircut. And so what does that mean? It often means that we don't have enough money for construction when we start. So then when we add another $50,000 to that, we're just making the situation worse. And so we think having it in its own light item is an excellent idea and are very, very supportive of that, because now we don't have to worry about whether or not we're gonna get an additional haircut from the Art and State Buildings program, which unfortunately can create some tension. Again, we love the program, so it's not about whether or not we love the program, but we also have an obligation to deliver these projects. And so sometimes that can put us into conflict, and that's not great, right? Because we wanna work really well together when we're selecting the art and really well together on the installation of the art. The other piece of that, and it goes back to your funding question, is we've heard, and it's very, very true, selection of these projects earlier in the process is better, because then that allows us to make sure that the architect during the design process is figuring out how they're going to incorporate that art into the building. So when we don't select it until we're going into construction and the drawings have already been done, that's problematic, because now we need to figure out how we're going to install this art in a building that's already been fully designed, and in some cases might even be under construction. That's also really problematic. The challenge there is, as you've seen here, we've testified many times, sometimes it will take us, depending on how large a project is, it can take up to 5 to 8 years to go all the way through planning to construction, right? So if we want to know early, so we want to know either in planning or we want to know in schematic design, which is the first phase of design. But if it's a 5 to 8 year project, like you said, okay, well now we have this money, but now the money's getting old, and could it be swept? In this particular bill, it proposes putting it into a specific fund. So although I'm not a financial guru, and I'd have to look to Becky or Ledge Council to answer this question, I think once we transfer it out of the capital bill and into a specific fund, we are making that appropriation, meaning for the way that we look at money in the capital bill, it looks like it's expended because it's been transferred and it's no longer sitting in the capital bill account. If that all makes sense to everybody. Now, again, I'm not a legal guru and I could be wrong on that, but it does talk about transferring the funding into a specific account. So to me, that transfer means now it's in an account and it's safe from being swept out of the capital bill.
It has to be used within 2 years, or it's subject to repro.
But if it's swept out of the capital bill and it no longer exists on the books, I think we should get testimony from a financial person on that.
Because that's true of every project that we have. It's out of the,
Because Madam Chair, within the capital bill, it's whether or not it's been expended. If we transfer it out of the capital bill, it looks like it's been expended because it goes into a separate account.
but our building community grants program, if they get the money and they don't use it within that allotted period of time, we can
Because we
reallocate
haven't
it.
transferred the funding out of the capital bill. It's still sitting in the capital bill.
I don't believe so on that. I'm not sure, but I don't,
It lives in the spreadsheet.
They don't get the money till they give us the invoices.
so the invoices and it's
So
all
we sit on the
completed.
money, we're
But
essentially.
the money stays in the capital bill in that case.
Yeah, whereas if we're transferring it to the Arts Council, we're paying the Arts Council, we're paying it out, I think. But we should check with finance.
Right, I'm not a finance
Yeah.
person, but that would be the way that I would personally interpret that.
Can you make a note of,
Confidence.
hang on, folks. Can you make a note of that, Becky, on that? That would be working with our joint fiscal office on that.
So it's sort of analogous to an interagency transfer.
Yeah.
It
That's the
becomes
way
a
I would
reserve
do it.
fund, but I don't know how.
But you got bonded money.
How the reserve funds are established.
Yeah, and you got bonded money, so I don't know how that would play out. So let's have our legal counsel and joint fiscal office take. Michelle, I see your hand up.
Michelle Bailey from the Vermont Arts Council. I just wanted to say that the program was set up originally and has been such that when a project is identified, that funding goes to an art acquisition fund since the program began.
Right.
And so it sits there attached to that building project until it can happen. So, for example, we identified the Supreme Court a few years ago, and so that we could get in early on the planning, but then that's been delayed. So I would hesitate to say 2 years, just because sometimes, as you were saying, it can be a few years longer. And right now it sits in that art acquisition fund that we only access. I think it sits at opposite of finance, because we put in a request, once we go to contract with an artist, we request it from them, from there, so.
So it doesn't sit in the fund within the Arts Council that you can tap. You have to go through
Yes,
finance and management.
yes,
to get it.
that's been our process, so that's, as much as I know, I don't know the details.
Right, I'm not a financial guru, I just feel like it's not, so when we
So-
pull the capital bill for you and we do reappropriation, it's not sitting there because it's not actually sitting in the capital bill at that point because it's been transferred.
Eric?
When we review our Capcom's spreadsheet, there will be a hit on a project and I'll say, where did that money go? It's gone. It's gone to Art and State Buildings. So that means at least for
For our
our
purposes.
it's left the capital bill bonding authority spreadsheet and gone to a real account. So that may animate it, as it were, as opposed to convert it from authority to actual money.
Okay, so let's have our legislative council and our joint fiscal office take a look at this and come back to us.
Yeah.
John?
What I don't want to see is a use it or lose it fund.
Let's have our legislative council and joint fiscal office weigh in on this and come back with the information so that we have more information that we can make a decision on, because we don't have enough information right now for that. But one thing, Commissioner, that I'm picking up though, that I'm not sure we've addressed it in the language is the timing of when a building is chosen, because that seems to be an issue. And I'm not sure if the language really addresses that. What I've been hearing in testimony is the sooner everyone knows that there's a building that's been chosen, then particularly if there's any artwork that has been chosen that's integral to the construction of that building, can be included in the either schematic design or design documents to get ready to go out to bid. And I don't think that's been really clarified in the bill.
Yeah, I can only speak to my most recent experience because before it was with Commissioner Cole. So what I would say, and we talked about this out in the hallway, because in order for us to select a project, we have to know whether or not that project is going to be supported by the legislature, right? So we need that the initial year of the biennium to be approved by the legislature so that we know what projects are going to be approved and move forward. And so I don't think we would be able to make those decisions until at least after the first part of the biennium when the capital bill has been passed. Because otherwise we're making judgments on things we don't know whether or not it's going to be supported. So I think that's the earliest that we would ever be able to have that conversation and dialogue about what projects will be selected.
So let's play that one through a little bit. So just, I'm looking here. Just to see what is appropriate here. So I'm gonna pick two things. So we have planning dollars in for two items. One is the permanent replacement to Woodside. We've put in $1 million. That's the first planning that you up front. And then we've also got the Washington County Courthouse in Barry. Got $750,000 again for planning. So those two projects, we want to do them. We don't know if we're going to do them. We need to get more specific planning and schematic design possibly to see what are the possibilities and what is the cost. So for those two projects, are you saying it's too early because we're putting the planning money in initially? We need to do a little bit more planning before we can decide if we want to incorporate any art within that which building's going to be chosen.
So I would think, if to be safe, right, because sometimes we do planning and there may not be alignment and that project may never get funded for design. I think in my mind, the safest place to start having that conversation is when we're in schematic design, because at that point, again, you don't know that you're going to get funding for construction, But there's at least alignment, I believe, between the administration and legislature on what that facility will be in the future. You know, we've made, so if you think about women's correctional and reentry, we've made, at this point in the game, we're not there yet. We've made a decision about whether that's gonna be a co-located facility or separate facilities, where it's gonna be likely located in the state. Like, we've made some initial decisions and we have a unified, hopefully, vision on that project moving forward. So I think that's probably the earliest we would be able to have that conversation. I think if we have it in planning, but we don't have alignment or we don't get support for design, then we don't know if it's gonna move forward.
So should the language be as blunt as saying that at the schematic design level, at that process timeframe, that is when a project is chosen? Or a building is chosen to be part of the
I feel
project?
comfortable with that, but I wanna make sure that my counterpart feels comfortable with that.
Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would make sense because of the timing of it all. We don't wanna have an artist sitting for 6 years for a project that may never happen or whatever. I'm
Right.
exaggerating, but so if there is a schematic design. The other thing with that line item is allows us flexibility to carve out a little bit of money for paying an artist to sit on a design team for that schematic process in order to identify some of those opportunities, and then we would have a little better idea in terms of planning for your construction.
So for the committee, that could be proposed language changes to what's here. And that's why we have Becky sitting here, because she can incorporate some of these thoughts and ideas. Wayne and then Chip.
So during your process, when you get to schematic design, my question is whether or not it needs to be something in your policy in terms of how you go forward. Because when you get to your schematic design process, you could have a trigger that says, well, one of the things you immediately do is you talk to the Arts Council as to whether or not there's a project that would be suitable for this particular building. And if that was just a general operating SOP, standard operating procedure, then you would do that. And then at that point in time, you'd know whether or not there was something there, and then follow up would be eventually the funding.
That's correct. So, and that's, again, it was trickier because it was COVID and I was a new commissioner, but basically what happened is we sat down with the Arts Council, David was there, and we went through the biennium and we looked at the different projects and I made some suggestions. Now, part of those suggestions were based on where I knew we had art and where I knew we didn't have art, because, I mean, I guess it depends on what you want to do, but I'd love to spread the art around throughout the state. And so we identified some projects where we knew there was no art existing in those buildings, and I made those recommendations, and subsequently, right, it went out to the committee and they supported them. But I do, that is one of the components, right? Do we have any art in that building? So Asa Bloomer is a great example. It is a very vanilla white, it looks like a mall from the 1980s, and it's not overly friendly or inviting. So I thought, perfect candidate for art in state buildings. It needs some light, it needs some warmth, it needs some color.
You need a directory.
A new director. We got one. Maybe we can bring that into the art inspection.
An artistic directory.
But it needs something, and it's a perfect building because it's a client service building for the Agency of Human Services, right? We get lots of families in there, so we want it to be welcoming. So anyway, that's why I suggested that one, just to give you an example of the kind of thoughts that are going through and making recommendations.
So if it worked that way, if at that point in the project, you contacted them, find out about arts project, then the next step would be, at what point in time would the money for that project come into play? It would be a little farther down in the process, right? And so, but you'd have to plan for the money, whether or not there's enough money in the 75,000 or ask for more in a particular year or something like that, if it was a line item. And then, so at what point, or what would we write in there into the language in order to assure that in either next year or how far down the road in that project before you need that money to do the art project?
And I think that goes back to Madam Chair's question about having JFO and Ledge Council in here to say, at what point in the process is the money protected, for lack of a better term, from being swept?
Or what John mentioned about a cap. The art acquisition fund can't get over a certain level. That's the other way of also addressing that.
I think that question needs to be answered before I can answer that question.
Chip and then Troy and then Tristan.
So I agree with the commissioner that I think the earliest that we can think about this is when we have a schematic design. We really need to know what this building is going to look like before we can think in terms of what kind of art may be there. So aside from the funding, and also the point that you made, Michelle, is like you having an artist waiting around for 4 or 5 years to contract, a piece of art in a building is not reasonable either. So I think if those two could come together, we would have the ideal timing in order to have a design and move forward on implementation of both the building and the piece of art.
Now, there will be situations where we may have, there are situations where we know a project is likely to be expensive. And we know we can't attain or it's not likely that we can attain all the money in a 2 to 3 year period. So women's correctional reentry is a good example of that, where we don't know what the price tag is yet, but we know it will be a higher dollar amount. And so it's not realistic to say we're gonna get all the money that we need within a 3 year time period. So there are some caveats to, when is the project selected versus how long are we holding the artist? But we also want to make sure they're early enough in the design process. So having some amount of flexibility would be helpful, because I just don't want to lock us in and then it's rigid and then we miss an opportunity like women's correctional reentry, for example, which segues into one of my other comments. But that's just an example of what I mean, where sometimes we need multiple years to have enough for construction.
So I have a couple more questions and then we're going to continue with your testimony. Troy and then Tristan.
We've seen projects that have resulted from this program. I'm curious to know, is there any historical tracking of how those came to fruition and when the money was allotted? And are we spending 50 grand a year?
So if it's okay, I'm going to refer to my two counterparts on the bench because they know this much better than I do. So David and Michelle.
I can respond.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Yes, I have tracked, every year and even through joint fiscal or the office. When we request money, we have to tell them what fiscal year it came from. And there's a track of all that year. We spend the $50,000 every year that we've gotten it, which has been, I think with my present memory, I think there's only 1 year that we didn't allocate any money, but we spend it. And in the early years of the program, we were able to spread the money around to 4 or 5 buildings because we had $50,000 in 1988. Now we really focus on one project because to really have a significant visual artistic impact, we keep it one project. But there may be multiple artists that are commissioned for one building. And then what was the other question was
visually it then shifts, right, into our possession. And once the Arts Council sees them through the entire process, working with the panel, everything that informs the work and allows it to be created. From that point on, it shifts into our custody, our maintenance, our monitoring of it, and often the materials developed by the artists for the ultimate work of art are in our possession as well. So the collection itself actually has some items that were developed by artists as they work toward the ultimate product.
Do you have a guess at the longest span of time between allotment and payout? Is it 5 years? Is it?
Depends on
probably
the
no
project.
more than that. It's probably less than that.
3 to 4, I would say.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
We've
Yeah.
experienced
That's helpful.
3 to
Thank you.
4.
And
Yeah,
some of them go really quickly, like
depends what it
the
is.
cemetery, the Veterans Cemetery. I
Yeah.
feel like that one went very quick. There's a beautiful Morgan horse there. And I feel like that one was selected and within a year we had an installation.
But like when we did the Waterbury Complex, and that was a mural on the stairway wall, and that was part of the construction for that.
And that was multiple years.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
we combined 2 years or 2 and a part of a year. I mean, 1 and a part of a year.
Right.
To do Waterbury so that we had enough for the mural, and there's a kinetic sculpture in the courtyard there as well. So we We're able to combine school years a little bit in some places so that we could expand, because 50,000 just doesn't do what it used to. So we've been trying to, where there's larger projects,
Combine those
combine
two
some
50.
years. Which is another reason why having a minimum as opposed to a cap helps just to fluctuate
And have the
depending on
flexibility.
what you have in the pipeline for construction, so.
And if it's a line item, then at least it needs to come through the governor's recommend. If the governor doesn't put it in, then it would be imperative for the committees to put it in. And that's where you determine what are the projects that are in the pipeline. And what's the cost of those projects? Is it a big building that we're doing, or is it a $10 million building or a $30 million building? And then you can adjust that line item appropriation for that. Instead of now, it's kind of hidden
That's right.
where the money, how it gets transferred, because there's no line item. Interesting.
Madam Chair, Commissioner, I'm gonna go really philosophical if that's okay, but it's really to kick the tires on the spending in the end. And if I think about really great buildings like the one we're in right now, the art, the architecture, the function, the civics of it, it all is one. You really can't, and that's I think what makes a great building, and we know some of those that we've been able to. We probably all have our favorite buildings, and probably none of them are state buildings being built today, except for some of this art, some of this wonderful humanity that we're able to bring into it. And my only concern is that we're not setting ourselves up for success. If you're having to choose, if you're looking at your budget and having to choose, it's like, arts and music in public school, because it's the first to get cut, because it's not seen as essential to the curriculum. It's kind of what I'm getting at here. And I think if we're building great buildings and we're taking your architects and getting the best work out of them, it's all the way, we think about our correctional facilities that we all know we need to think about building and designing. We want the human beings interacting with those facilities to be healed and rehabilitated and to be able to have a place they're proud to go to work. And it's all that's what the promise of architecture is to do that all in one unified capacity. And then we compartmentalize it and we find the line where it gets paid for, and that's the hard work of this committee. But I want to zoom out and ask you if we're setting you up and your PGS up to do that in this way we're funding this.
So I think the way we fund it now is problematic, only in that we're very supportive of the program, but like I mentioned, the haircut scenario.
Yeah.
So then it becomes a conflict with the team, and there's something else in the bill that we'll get to, but in addition to, the art and taking the $50,000, there's often some amount of cost for the installation. So it's even more than $50,000 in the end in terms of what we're spending. And so the challenge there again is it's creating, we don't want conflict, right? But the PM is going to be focused on the cost of the project, because that's one of the three things, right? Quality, cost, and schedule. That's what they're going to focus on. And we love art. So it's not to say that we don't love art, but it just creates an inherent conflict with the team. And so I believe by having a separate line item, now we're not necessarily, you could do this one of two ways. We could say, we're gonna pick the project and we're gonna make sure we're adding in the 75,000 or the 50 or whatever is the limit we all agree to. And we do that, but then again, I still don't have control because it's still gonna take haircuts, right? Or we put it in a separate line item, and we'll talk about who makes the request in a minute, but whether we make it or whether the Arts Council makes it, like, yes, it goes to the administration. They could approve or deny that request, right? And their proposal may come and say $0 for that program, but then you as the legislature get to make a decision as to whether or not you want to fund that line item. I think by keeping it a separate appropriation, it creates less conflict with the project manager and trying to control the cost of the schedule. So that's just my personal feelings on how I think it would be better to have its own line item.
So that's a decision we'll have to make here as a committee, so we can flag that. So keep going on here.
So I just had some things that I thought were interesting. So if we go to page 2, and under definitions, it talks about state buildings. I think this is a carryover from language that was probably created a very long time ago. So if we are opening the bill and we're looking to modernize the language, I would focus on what the definition of a state building or facility is, because it talks about permanent structure, park, or permanent structure thereof, wholly or partially enclosed, owned, or leased by state government. Then it talks specifically about the University of Vermont, State Agricultural College, and Vermont State Colleges. So when they refer to commissioner in this bill, I'm pretty sure they're referring to the Commissioner of Buildings and General Services. I don't have any view at all over what's going on with universities and colleges in the state. So the challenge there is that I don't have any visibility today. BGS did have visibility many years ago. And so, and if you look at the definition of a state facility underneath the BGS commissioner, you're going to see that there's a very specific definition in statute, which does not include colleges or universities. So it's not to say that this is necessarily problematic, and it's really a decision for you all to make. I'm just saying at the moment, BGS commissioner does not have a relationship, maybe I should, but at the moment, I don't have a relationship with colleges and universities. So the language is, we could not change it. I'm just saying that because I don't have visibility, it's very unlikely that universities or colleges in the state, that I would select a project for one of those universities or colleges, only because they're not underneath my jurisdiction and I don't have a relationship there. So if we want to, it's up to you on whether or not you want to clean up that language or not. And the only other thing, and I know you have a question, is correctional facilities are specifically called out as a facility that we will not put an art installation in. And I think if we're going to open this language, I would strongly advocate for this art to be able to go into correctional facilities. We've talked a lot in this committee about the power of these buildings and their ability to reintegrate people successfully back into society. And we did recently do one. Well, we've actually done our installation at VCPH, the mental health care facility in Berlin, and we have one going on in the one in Essex. And I want to advocate for those populations and say that I think art is really important for them. And so I'd like to see that be an eligible use for the funding.
Before Becky leaves, Becky, can you just kind of compare what the commissioner just brought up in terms of the powers and duties of the commissioner and how it works with state buildings versus this definition here, and see if there is a conflict or not?
Becky Wasserman, Legislative Council. I guess I would just note that just because it doesn't line up, it's not cross-referencing. I think it's just how the legislature had defined it for the purpose of this program. I think the point is whether or not it would actually be art would be installed in those facilities.
In UVM or the colleges.
Right, but I don't think there's a conflict to define it in different parts of statute in different ways. I think the issue is whether or not it's sort of administratively going to happen in those.
In the University of Vermont or the state colleges. Okay, that's a policy decision for us. Is Troy your?
Yeah.
Troy and then Wayne.
I'm just curious if the University of Vermont or the state colleges team have ever asked to tap into this.
I don't know.
This came from, I think, let me give some history here. I think we used to fund with our appropriation here for state colleges or UVM. We used to fund a specific building with our capital dollars. And we don't do that anymore because it took us 5-6 years to accumulate enough money for the university or the state colleges to have the state dollars to go ahead with construction. So now we just do it major maintenance. But back then, we had a building that was targeted, like Johnson Library. Johnson State, we built that library, Linden Library, UVM, Dewey Hall, or whatever. So we would target our capital dollars to that specific building. And I think that's where this language came from. Because if you go down, it says it is constructed or renovated in part or totally with funds appropriated by the General Assembly. That refers to UVM and state colleges with a building. That's what I'm thinking with what we used to do. Michelle
Bailey, Vermont Arts Council. Yeah, I would agree, Alice. I mean, we did fund, I used to look at the capital budget way back in the 90s and we would find, oh, look, the library is being done.
Yeah.
So we have art in Linden Library, Johnson Library, and then at Castleton, the Stafford.
I don't want to ask this question, but what's going to happen?
Yeah, right. It's not there now, but because it changed to a line item of maintenance for years and years and years, we've not done anything for colleges because I didn't know either, and the commissioner usually didn't know. So
yeah, because
the works of art are, however, still state-owned works of art. So we do have works of art at UVM. We have works of art at all of the colleges. technically they're in our custody, in our care. That may be something we might want to look at, actually, because many of these colleges have art departments who might be a better, way of deaccessioning them potentially to the colleges so that they're truly owned by those institutions rather than by the state.
And to be clear, I'm neutral on this, so it doesn't really matter to me. I just wanted to point that out, that I just noticed it when I was doing my review. If you want to leave it in there to have flexibility for the future, I'm fine with that. I just wanted to point that out, though, for the committee, and again, advocate that the art installations can be done at correctional facilities.
Well, also never mind. Welcome to Art and State Buildings program. It is not an easy burden.
No.
Chip?
So I'm just curious, fairly recently, I guess, in the Derby State Police Barracks, my friend Liz Nelson did the mural there. How did that all come together? I mean, did we have this kind of difficulty when that happened? And I'm sure there was a long planning process to build that barracks.
I don't have visibility into that one.
That was
the building was identified and it was, in the line for construction, and I don't recall any problems. We just we knew we were looking at the most public spaces within that facility, so we looked at the lobby, the conference room, and outside opportunities. We ended up we do a statewide call to artists to offer opportunities for our Vermont artists to get a commission in these buildings, and we did the process, and Liz was selected, and she figured out which images, where paintings would go, all of that stuff as part of her design process. It was probably one of the more straightforward projects in terms of just kind of.
I suspected that it was. That's why I brought it up. I mean, it really probably went through without a whole lot of difficulty. Yeah.
And it's by no means the only state police barracks.
Yeah.
Other state police barracks are also recipients of Art and State Buildings. So the audiences are sometimes limited, but that's one of the things that the panels always address, is how public is the art? How public will it be? Where are the opportunities for public interaction? Sometimes they're very limited.
Yes.
But it is a program that is intended to enhance facilities, as you're suggesting with the correctional facilities, in the way that the psychiatric hospitals, for example, which are certainly not public facilities, but the art is there for the inhabitants of those facilities.
Yeah. I mean, I was really pleasantly surprised when I saw Liz's piece there. It's a really beautiful piece, and it's in the lobby of a state police barracks, but it certainly, I'm sure, lightens up the day of some of the troopers that spend time there.
Wayne?
I just want to go back to Troy's, because Troy was asked about the same question that I was going to ask, but I hear the answers to it. So essentially, the Arts Council, we don't really have a program now to actively put art into colleges and it's something that happened before. You do have some pieces there, but it's not an ongoing program. And we know what we have a need for the state buildings. So my question might be cleaner for us to just take the state colleges out of there, because if you ever did need a request for colleges or DPM, that could come as a separate request and wouldn't have to go through the planning processes that go through their planning process, not BGS's planning process.
And the big thing I'm trying to point out is I just don't have visibility. So it's not to say that I disagree or I'm opposed to the art going in at universities and colleges. I think that's a great idea. I don't have the ability though to recommend those because I don't know anything about those buildings and I don't know any of their plans.
Right. But this is a definition within this particular statute that pertains to the Art and State Building. So, we look to our legal counsel for the language, but we should flag whether or not in the definition on page 2, between slides 15 and 16, if we keep UVM and state colleges in there or not. that's gonna be a policy decision when we do markup. When we go through the bill, do we include this language or not? We will have Becky with us. Okay? Chip?
Could we incorporate some bridge language so that we could, as for instance, include the chancellor of the state colleges or the president of the University of Vermont in conjunction with the buildings and general services to.
But we don't target our money towards specific buildings anymore like we used to. Our money that we have in the Capitol bill now, they're laughing, so I don't trust what they're laughing about. They looked at us and laughed, and me, they looked at. I'm
well,
like, now what?
Laughing while
They're missing the tiara. I think we haven't had enough tiara this year.
No, we got plenty of tiara. I mean, the money that we put there now goes to major maintenance.
Right, understood. I'm not saying that it should be line item for the state colleges. I'm saying that we could use some bridge language, just that we could clear up the issue of the commissioner not having the feeling that she has authority to do this by incorporating someone from state colleges to work with.
But this is under the definition of what a state building or facility is. That's the definition for the purposes of art and state buildings. It's not, what Becky was saying, it is not
Yes, I see.
connected
Yep.
to the powers and duties of the commissioner.
Right.
It is, what are we defining for the
Definition,
purpose
Yep.
that would receive funding and a piece of art through our art and state buildings? We haven't been doing UVM and state colleges because we don't fund specific buildings anymore like we used to. That's the shift that's occurred.
Okay.
We gotta keep
get it.
moving, folks, because we gotta get rid through the bill. Tristan?
Okay, this might have been a question for Becky, but the donation aspects of
Yeah,
this
we're
bill?
not there yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're not there yet.
And I might speed past that one, so
but-
stop me if I go too far.
Are you planning on speaking at the top of page 3, project site?
I was planning on page 4, but let me see what's on page 3.
Is the 1 million too low?
Too low.
I mean, should it be higher? Because our projects are becoming so expensive. Is the 1 million still an appropriate level?
Well, it's 1 million or more, right?
Right, so any construction projects 1 million or more, is the million still an appropriate trigger?
I guess I'm neutral. I agree with you, Madam Chair, that projects are getting more expensive. The other thing though is I think you're gonna see us continue to do more larger deferred maintenance projects over time. So your boilers, your roofs, and because they're becoming too expensive to be in the major maintenance line item, which is why we're popping them out into individual line items. So, Asa Bloomer is a good example where, if you look at it, the appropriation per year has been smaller. If you total it up over the last several years, it's above $1 million. But the reason why I picked that one again was because I knew it didn't have any art and because I knew it really needed. It needs some love. That building needs some love. And so that's why I picked it. So the only thing about
He
raising.
doesn't need love. He needs a new jacket.
The only thing about possibly raising that is it just gives less flexibility, especially for buildings that start.
Gotcha.
Touche.
I think you all look lovely, so,
That's an inside joke.
okay, well, you all look lovely. So, my only concern about raising that dollar amount, I agree with you, projects are getting more expensive, but then if we're gonna be focused more on larger deferred maintenance projects in the capital bill, is that gonna prevent some of these buildings that have been woefully overlooked for many years and need some art?
Okay, I just wanted to bring that out because
It's a good, so I'm neutral on that, I guess.
Okay.
On page 4, lines 5 and 6, it talks about BGS submitting the capital bill request. The Arts Council does submit a capital bill request for their cultural grants, I think it's what it's called, but I could be wrong. And so, again, I'm somewhat neutral on this, I'm just pointing out things that the committee may want to talk about. Does it make more sense for it coming from BGS, or does it make more sense coming from the Arts Council, knowing that they do have the ability to request that capital bill? Because really, if you think about it, they're the ones that are leading this initiative. We are obviously supporting the initiative, and there's a big role that BGS plays, but should we be the ones asking for that every year, or should it be the Arts Council? Again, I'm neutral, but a good thing for you all to decide.
So we'll flag that.
So there's
So other
that.
people, please flag that. Take your notes.
And then on page 6, line items 5 through 10, I think this is kind of where maybe we have the largest consternation in the bill. Because, and to be honest and transparent, right, Michelle and I have this conversation, it's about which side of the equation are you looking at, right? So, my concern is without any sort of fenders or barriers around this. And I think Eric the other day did a great analogy with the whale hanging from the ceiling and having to put in a girder, and that gets really expensive. I think without any boundaries around, you know, how much it might cost to install or how much it might cost to do lighting or other things, you know, at some point to do the installation might even cost more than the art. And so that is another potential conflict point, right? Between BGS and the Arts Council. So I'm not saying that there aren't certain situations like we talked about Essex and the fact that all they had to do was put in blocking the wall. No big deal. Blocking doesn't cost that much money. We're happy to do it, right? But if all of a sudden we're paying $1 million to support this art installation, I know that's an exaggeration, but it just helps make the point, that becomes problematic. So I'm just flagging this language to say, I do agree that depending on how much it costs to install it, that BGS should pay for that as part of the construction cost. But I think to say it's an open checkbook and not have any boundaries around that becomes problematic.
So for the committee, how that gets addressed is we'll take further testimony from the Arts Council and BGS in terms of defining more what those boundaries could be. It could be a dollar amount, it could be written within the Arts Council's guidelines for the program, that type of thing. So we'll vet that when we go through it. Wayne?
So back to, schematic design, where again, if at schematic design, consult with them about projects. And then where in your design process will then you be able to estimate what the cost of installation would be? Will that be early enough in that process so that it enables you so that your project managers are not stressed?
Earlier would be better. You make a very excellent point. So earlier would be better. And yes, every phase of design, right, we do another probable cost of construction. And so you are correct. If we're thinking about the art early on, we're getting with that architect, they're going to incorporate that into the design, and that would be part of that estimate. I do believe, though, there should be some transparency on that, because let's say, because we always give you an estimate when we start, right? And we update that estimate over time, and that's when you see us come back and request more funding. So again, I know this is a huge exaggeration, this would never happen, but just for the committee to make this example easy to understand and comprehend. If all of a sudden my request goes up by $1 million, which I know is very unlikely, so again, this is a huge exaggeration, and I come back to the committee and they say, wait a minute, this is a huge jump from what you told us it was going to be. Why all of a sudden is it so, what is the reason for this big jump? Right, then we have to come and explain that, and we would testify to that. But and again, I'm not saying we don't want to support it. I just think for it to be very open-ended and not to have anything around it, for me, is problematic.
But see, my thinking is
Suffering for art.
during your, during schematic design, when you go to them to see whether or not you get a project, what it's about, and then you're still in your process of design and estimation. That's before you're going to request the money or get the money from that year. So if it turned out at that point in time, you knew that this project that they're proposing was going to require this much in installation, then it could be part of the process of funding it. So you're not coming back after the fact to ask for money. You know upfront that there's going to be extra money for this design. So it's planned into our funding for this, or your funding.
That's right.
Right, so then it becomes part of a project cost that we increase the dollar amount in the capital bill for that particular project.
Either the capital bill or the money that BGS is going to provide for installation, because they're saying they're doing some of that.
Right, but if the cost goes up, they have to come to us because the project cost for that construction has increased. So then it's a line item for that project itself.
That's right.
It's not Art and State Buildings that would pick that up. It would be the project cost for the building.
That's right, Madam Chair, and we have that chart in the book. So even when we're early in the process, we try to do our best job that we can at the time of what we know to tell you what we think that project is going to cost over the years, right? But then we come back in further subsequent years and we adjust our request because now we know more than we did early on. And I have two groups I have to answer to because I've got the administration. So if they know what my spending profile in theory was in the beginning and all of a sudden it's going up and again, I don't think this is likely. I'm just playing the scenario out to make a case about the boundaries. And it goes up to the administration, they say, well, gee, this project increased by this much, why? They're either gonna support it or deny it. So it's gonna go through that process and then I'm gonna be sitting in this seat or somebody from our BGS team. And they're gonna have to then explain what the increase is. And again, I think it's unlikely, so I'm not trying to make this like a burning issue. I just think I'm pointing this out to say this is very open-ended language, and I'd just like to see some amount of parameters around it. That's all. Or as you said, Madam Chair, in the guidelines or something.
Well, it's very clear that it was saying that if we do a line item, I'm just thinking this through. If we do a line item, I'm just putting in 75,000 for that discussion. We put a line item of 75,000. And then the art for that particular building is in the schematic design piece. And it's like, oh my God, it's going to be 200,000 to install this because it's going to be part of the design of the building. And there's only 75,000. But the language here is saying is that the Art and State Buildings Fund is not going to pick that up. That's the conflict. Because the Arts Council is protecting the money and BGS will then be on the hook for that 200,000. That's what this language is saying.
We always get beat up about how expensive our projects are. And then that puts our project managers in a position, that's a conflict we're talking about. It puts our project managers in a situation where they get beat up about the cost of the projects. And so they're naturally inclined to want to hold, we try to hold costs down as much as we can. I'm just saying that it even puts more pressure on them to confine the cost of the project, which then does create a little bit of this, unfortunately.
John?
If we try to come up with language to fit in here to put some guardrails around this, somebody's gonna be back in here, and I'll ask this question now, preemptively. Are the lines of communication adequate now between the design team, the architect, that is the architect, BGS, and the Art Council to mitigate that problem? In other words, somebody says, no, we can't do that. I don't want to try to build something around this and become so restrictive.
Yeah, and neither do I. So, Michelle?
I could address that. So this language that you're reading in the statute has been in our guidelines from the beginning. And we have a local committee for a building that we're working on. And that local committee who decides on the artists and works with them to develop the design includes the architect, project manager, people who work in the building, and some arts professionals. And together, as we're developing a design, the role of the project manager and the architects have been, well, if we do that, here's what the implications may be on the budget.
Okay.
So it's an interactive, collaborative kind of discussion that happens. And,
But you have to know your lane.
the lane.
You have to know your lane.
Yes.
And that's where.
But each project is empaneled. In other words, from the outset, there are a group of people making the decisions together at the table at the same time.
I guess what my point is, and I appreciate the commissioner's concerns, let's not try to fix a problem that maybe doesn't exist.
That all
But it does exist.
Yeah.
It does exist because the arts projects that some of them are being installed, there's a high installation cost to that. And that's where some of the rub comes in, that BGS says, wait, we can't take this within the current project cost that's been allocated. And the Arts Council says, yeah, but we only have 50,000, so we can't deal with it.
Anyway.
And it's great when we're all working really well and David's been around, he's been with BGS for a long time. Michelle has been at the Arts Council for a long time. So I think, yes, there isn't really a problem right now. I think everybody gets along really well and it's working. But someday David won't be here and Michelle won't be here and we'll have other people in those leadership seats. And well, it will happen eventually. So my point is, it's working well now, but that doesn't mean that in the future we have a dynamic where it's not working so well.
Yeah, and I understand.
Okay, so we'll flag that. That's something we can work with Becky on. There may be some way of connecting this with a schematic design language that gets drafted. We'll see.
And those are the bulk of my comments. I appreciate that the state curator was added. The state curator has been part of this process all along, so it's nice to see that it was put into statute. So I thank the Arts Council for making it permanent, regardless of who's in the leadership seats in the future. And again, overall, and then I'm neutral on the amount of money that, whether it's 50,000, 75, whatever dollar amount, I'm neutral on that as well. So overall, I think this is great. I'm glad that this bill is being looked at, and overall supportive. Just a couple of things for the committee to think about as you continue to look at the language.
Do you have any thoughts on the maintenance and conservation of our projects, particularly if it's integral to the building design?
So that's an excellent question, Madam Chair, and something actually that I've been having a dialogue with the Arts Council for probably 3 to 4 years. Again, this is up to the committee in terms of, it's that same thing about, do we want to continue to just work collaboratively together, or do we want to actually put it in writing? So that is a great question for the committee. So my personal feeling is, as David said, once the art is installed, it becomes part of the art collection under the curator, and which means it's an asset now of BGS. And I believe as an asset of BGS, and it is eligible for things like the major maintenance fund, because if it's an asset, I treat it like any other asset in a building, and when it needs to be repaired, potentially relocated for the ones that can, because we talked about that the other day, then I believe, though again, this is me, this isn't written anywhere, that it is eligible for major maintenance funds, and we have been treating it like that in the last few years that we've been having this dialogue. That all said, it's not written down anywhere. So that's just something we're doing collaboratively together, but I believe BGS has an obligation to maintain this art over time.
So I want to go back to page 2, lines 3 to 7. This establishes the program, and it sets up the parameters of the Art and State Buildings program, that the funds would be used the funds are authorized to be used for purchasing, design, commission, fabrication, installation, and integration, either at the time of new construction or renovation of state buildings and other facilities. So what do we mean by other facilities? Is it the facilities that we've leased? Is it UVM? Is it state colleges? What do we mean by other facilities?
Question.
Can you come up with consider it safe?
Well, I always think as the BGS commissioner and the definition of what a state facility is under, so that's any lease or owned space under the jurisdiction of the BGS commissioner. I can't think beyond that because I've never been in a situation where I'm overseeing something outside of that for the state.
Do we put any art pieces in lease buildings?
Well, that was another good flag.
That goes in the definition of state building or facility further down on line 15. And if we're using state building throughout here as a definition, then it would include lease buildings.
And again, that's depending on how much flexibility the committee wants to have. I would say as the BGS commissioner, I feel more comfortable in owned space because lease space is really meant to be flex space. When we need more, we grab lease space, and then when we need less, we contract. You may want to leave the language in here, have that flexibility, but if I'm working with the Arts Council, and again, what's funded by the capital bill, you can spend capital bill dollars in lease space, but that's more rare than it is common. We do have a few examples. So my preference, so we're selecting line items usually, right, when we're working with the Arts Council. You could leave it in for flexibility, but my preference is state-owned space.
Hang on, Wayne. Because if you go to the definition of state building or facility, it's beyond BGS.
That's correct.
It's beyond BGS.
That's correct.
It is any state building or park that is wholly or partially enclosed, owned, or leased by state government. By
Well-
state government.
And the enclosed part's interesting too, because at the hatchery, for example, and I know there's other locations, we have the Roxbury Fish Hatchery, we have our installations that are outside.
But what I'm referring to, it's by state government. So it could be forests and parks, it could be fish and wildlife, it could be transportation, though we're very clear that salt sheds and highway garages and bridges and sewers are not part of this. But it's more than BGS that owns state buildings.
That's right, Madam Chair, and we did do the Roxbury Fish Hatchery, like I said, there's a few.
But the money came through the capital bill.
Yes,
The money came through the capital bill for that. Ed Weed Hatchery, the money came through the capital bill for that.
and it's outside, so it's not partially enclosed.
But the issue there is though that BGS's footprint's not on it, so how did the process deviate so that those things could get done without BGS involved?
We were actually, I know more than I do.
Well, I would, when I read this and read partially enclosed, I assumed that was the building or that there was some, like the
Oh, you
fish
think
hatchery
it's a definition of the
enclosed.
building and not a
Yes,
definition
not
of the
the art,
park.
in the
Okay.
guidelines, and they're actually, when you're looking at 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, there's some dots here, we start at definition number 8, and I don't have the
Yeah, I
Oklahoma
don't.
statute here, so there's some other definitions there.
So,
But I think
Chip, can you pull out
we have
29?
allowed outside art, I mean, to have sculpture not be a part of this as an outside piece would be a big.
Oh my God.
Say park.
Yeah, we have a lot of outdoor
Say park.
work,
Yeah,
so.
park, I don't know.
In fact, it's very common for public art to be exterior. That is
Yes.
very common.
But I do think, I thought it was referring to the building being enclosed as opposed to like a pavilion. I don't know, that's just the way that my mind was interpreting. I don't know legally what those definitions are, but I didn't think it was the art that did even.
But that doesn't mean we have to put a roof over the frog at the ag lab.
No, I don't think.
You put a little tent over the trout, the female trout having her babies.
And just to go back to the commissioner talking about lease space, I think that what she's saying is entirely correct. That we shouldn't really, for the most part, put public art, especially long-standing pieces that are intended to be there quite long, and you have no idea what will happen with leased space over time. The one exception that we've talked about in the past is the high concentration of state agencies and employees at the National Life Building on top of.
Yeah, we lease that.
That might be a situation that I would encourage you to talk about, because it's an audience that we can't really serve that maybe deserves art in state buildings. And there might be a way of saying something like that differentiates and a large concentration of leased space. But I know too that BGS is grappling with the uncertainty
That's right.
of what
space right now.
office needs in the future are gonna look like, so who knows?
And I would just add that if we did decide to keep the leased space opportunity, we could very easily, in our calls to artists, put a parameter on it that says it must be movable, that it's not like the floor in the building, or it's not,
Yeah.
that we could make it go with an agency or something that
Right.
on a particular project.
Right, so my two things on lease space would be, one, how long is the lease? So per statute, BGS can only enter into a 10-year lease.
Better though.
Yeah, I got it.
Anything beyond a 10-year
I do
lease
better
has to
with
be approved
paper
by
than I do
the
electronic.
legislature. So that's just one thing to keep in mind right here. Space.
Yep.
It's a 10-year time horizon. The second thing with National Life is that was the one lease space that I am aware of where the capital bill actually did appropriate quite a bit of money to do a refit of National Life after Tropical Storm Irene, and we moved to A&R, and there was an appropriation from the capital bill to do that. So in that case, we had a line item. So
Right.
I would say that kind of ropes it in, if we want to put parameters around lease space and capital bill investments. So there's that piece, and then I think the third piece, Michelle, is you hit the nail on the head. These aren't buildings that we own, so we would have to work with the landlord very carefully in that process, because they wouldn't want to have to worry about what is it going to cost them to install it, for example, or what is their responsibility for maintenance and conservation, like those kinds of things. So yes, I think it's possible to put it in lease space. I just think it's slightly more nuanced and complicated.
So one thing I would recommend for the committee is to go to Title 29, Section 41. Chapter 2, it defines the whole program, which is really helpful to get a whole context. So Title 29, Section, well, it starts with Section 41.
It's right here
Section
on
40.
Section 1 is the quote.
Yeah, but you gotta have the whole, you gotta have the whole sections. You gotta have the whole statute, because it talks about the use of funds. It talks about the powers and duties of the commissioner. It talks about funds transferred for the art that we don't see in the proposed language here. So for the definitions, some of the definitions is addition, means any new construction that increases the height or floor area. Contracting agency, they've explained what that is. Council means Vermont Council on the Arts. Commissioner means BGS. Occupant agency means the public entity that has or will have principal authority to use or occupy the public building. Mixed media means a combination of two or more types of materials to create the single work of art. Project costs means the budgeted cost of a construction or renovation project, excluding the cost of design and of land acquisition or land improvement. So some of the definitions may have to be updated by changing some of the use of the funds. Also, funds, what it says is funds transferred, and we do have this, is it does lay out, we do have at the bottom of page 3, but it does talk about the process of funds being transferred to BGS. So, and then it goes on to powers and duties of the commissioner, and then the duties of the contracting agency. And then the use of funds, and then the advisory committee. So it talks about the whole program. So I think it would be important for the committee to have the whole context. It's always online. If you want to look at it in the book, it's Title 29.
I just sent that away.
Wayne?
And so, again, on state buildings, Fish and Wildlife, Forest and Parks are not part of BGS. And they have, they're, right now, Fish and Wildlife is up at National Life. Nothing to say they couldn't get funding eventually with federal funds to build a new building to house them. And if that was to occur, say that somehow that occurred, then they also have, you heard A&R saying they have their own design people that do all that work. And they're doing their own maintenance and everything. So that's outside of BGS's realm. So essentially, talking with a different design team and a different maintenance team in that event, that could be talking to these folks. So it's a little bit more complicated. So we would put that fish down at Roxbury Fish Hatchery. Who paid for the installation? Yes.
Well,
Who's responsible for maintenance? Not BGS, you don't own it.
Well, according to David, we do, because
It
it's
is-
part of our.
Because you've got.
It is in the state
Okay.
collection.
Okay.
My power is far greater than BGS.
Oh, I think we need, I think we need a crown.
Here you go, David.
Not a tiara, you
I'm
need
glad
something
I'm
else.
here.
It'll do anything.
That was a little rough, David.
She's your boss.
Sorry, I was going for the laughter, and I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, you got it, David.
She's your boss.
Anyway,
All right.
it is a tricky thing, and of course, the project paid for it, right? Because there was no line item, so it came out of the project budget regardless.
and there was a BGS project manager that I worked with, so I
That's
don't
right,
know
Peter.
how well.
Heck, that was an interesting
That
one.
came up about Irene, so we had capital dollars, we had FEMA dollars. It was part of recovery from Irene. And we did pay for that through our capital budget. For that.
I personally love state parks.
So we probably just lose.
So I would be happy to put art installations in state parks because I go to many of them and I would enjoy it along with my family. So I would, it is tricky again, right? Because I don't have oversight of like A&R, for example, or V-Trans or military. And each one of those groups could build their own buildings. And again, this is all about relationships. I have personally, I've been in state government a long time, so I've got great relationships with all of these groups, me personally, again, not written in black and white, but, and so there's always discussions that happen behind the scenes if something new is being built for Fish and Wildlife and, you know, we think it's gonna be a great place where the public's gonna come, like the Roxbury Fish Hatchery, for example. I would be very supportive of proposing that particular project for the Arts Council's consideration.
And the only question is there anything that we need to tweak in this language just to codify anything there that would make everybody's life easier and
Well,
going forward?
maybe we
And if
need,
it's a line item, I feel like I feel like if it's a line item, maybe I'm wrong, Michelle, she's gonna maybe give me the evil eye, I don't know. I feel like if it's a line item in the capital bill, you tend to take testimony on line items, right? And then at the same time, you're seeing what the proposed capital bill projects will be, so it might even give maybe you don't want this, it might even give the legislature even more opportunity to have input on potential possibilities for an art installation. Maybe you want that, maybe
Do you want input? Do we want input?
I don't know. That's why I'm looking at Michelle and say, I don't know, but I'm just, you know,
you have the input through the advisory committee.
that's correct.
But you have two legislators on there. A member,
That's correct.
you got institutions in the House represented and you have institutions in the Senate
So
represented.
hopefully they would look at the whole capital bill, not just BGS's sections.
And as Michelle will tell you, public art, the whole idea of public art, which is the big idea, not just how we've done it. This conversation was almost 40 years ago in this building to address public art for Vermont. Percent for art is what many states did. Vermont opted for this program as written in statute currently, and the ramifications are such that it is, what I guess I would emphasize is thinking of it as our opportunity for our artists. So that's the part of the program too. It's not just being good consumers of art, it's also supporting the artists of Vermont and giving them the opportunities that they would otherwise never have. So this is a big program that supports artists and allows us to enjoy the benefits of the art as well.
So this is where, I don't know, I'm probably getting too much in the weeds here. But if you look at the definition of state buildings and facilities, not only are we saying any state building facility that is owned or leased by state government, you go down a little further on line 17, constructed or renovated in part or totally with funds from any appropriation of the General Assembly, any appropriation. So that could be something in the T-bill, that could be something in appropriation, it could be anywhere, it doesn't have to come from here. But the person who's recommending the project is the commissioner of BGS. But some of those are not BGS projects. And I don't know if that's a problem, may not have come up to the forefront as a problem because people have only been focusing on those projects that are part of the capital bill per se. And maybe the best thing to do is leave the language alone. But it's pretty broad language.
It is.
For the definition of state buildings or facilities.
Yep.
So I just want to highlight that for folks to think about if you want to do a deeper dive. But there could be projects coming to the commissioner that the commissioner knows nothing about. And then it's being done, the money's coming from somewhere else, and then all of a sudden that money has to go towards installation.
For an example,
That's what I'm trying to think.
building project that was appropriated outside of the capital bill that you would never know about.
Bennington, possibly the mental health beds down in Bennington. Possibly the mental health beds down in Bennington. The pod, well, you'd be involved with the pods. We did the pods. just, there are situations that pop up.
Bit of the Peace of Mind Emporium.
The what?
The Peace of Mind Emporium, the AOT district office in,
St. Albans?
no, it's down near Rutland.
Rutland.
Up the hill. That was a building they picked up during Irene.
I mean, traditionally, it's been projects in the capital bill, but the definition is any project in any part of state government that's funded by any appropriation of the General Assembly. So I don't know. I mean, that's pretty broad. Maybe we keep it that way and not poke a bear, sleeping bear.
Yeah, I would just add that, I mean, I think that if there's flexibility, it's always good. And as you were saying, the recommendation is coming from the commissioners to our advisory committee, so.
And maybe the
that's
other
how
agencies, maybe the other agencies don't know they could apply.
I want them in my buildings, so I'm just teasing. I mean, again, I think it comes down, if it's not in black and white, it comes down to collaboration and communication and and awareness of this program so that other agencies and departments could, in theory, if we leave it the same, come to the BGS commissioner and say, hey, you've got this appropriation, we're building this building, you think it would be a good candidate for the Arts and State Building Program.
So I have one more question. Page 1, lines 18 and 19, we're eliminating encouraging donations of works of arts. Encourage the donation of work of arts to the state for its permanent collection or
Madam-
exhibition. And just want to flag that.
Madam Chair, can I piggyback on that?
Yeah.
Because on page 4, around line 17, we're continuing to, we have language around accepting donations. So I just wonder if this is being considered together.
This is a great question for Michelle and David.
It's a great question for Becky.
Okay, I was gonna say, but they can talk about the donations
Yeah.
piece.
I would just add that when I was looking through this language, my recommendation was not to eliminate the ability to receive donations, but to remove the word encourage, because this is a commissioning program, and there was some other verb, manage, support, consider, I don't know, whatever that is, that we could still have donations, but again, it's a commissioning program, and we really want to emphasize the ability to pay our artists and not to encourage all the artists to do everything for free, so.
That was the way I was going to answer this. Again, you heard me say what I did about supporting artists in the state of Vermont. This is language, frankly, that dates so far back to when the grappling with the whole idea of public art was a tough one. We're now almost 35 years later. We all, I think, around the table, I'm hoping, accept this whole idea that there is a valid role for government to play in supporting artists and supporting the creation of public art. So the encouraging of donations is like saying that we encourage the plumber to donate the piping in the building. In other words, I honestly think it's insulting language for a program that is about creating the art and setting up that whole premise. My office always takes donated art. Down in the lobby, I knew we didn't have the money for a portrait of Alexander Twilight for this building. So where did I go? The Friends of the State House. I asked them to commission it. They donated it. So we have always accepted donated art, but this program is about creating art, commissioning art. And that's why I think it's time to clean it up a little bit. Take that out of this statute. If you want to encourage donated art, that could be revisited in the state curator's part of statute, perhaps, where that's maybe where that belongs, rather than with the public art commissioning program.
That makes sense. But it is under the chapter, there's art and state buildings. And then within that art and state buildings, there is a specific art and state buildings program. But the definitions are specific to the art and state buildings program. The art acquisition fund is specific to the art and state buildings program. And the funds that are transferred to the art. And then you get into the powers and duties of the commissioner are specific to the art and state buildings program. And under that is that the commissioner can establish procedures to accept donations to the state artwork for installation in state buildings and facilities. So my quandary is, for the art and state buildings program that we're trying to administer with the 75,000, if we put in a line item or whatever, that we don't expect artists to donate to that program. But we don't want to tie the hands of the curator or anybody being able to accept art donations for our collection. And I'm not sure the language is clear on that, because of the definition section of the powers and duties is within the program of art and state buildings, the way it's structured.
In the 35 years, Alice, I cannot recall a single instance where this program actually brought in donated art. That I will hasten to add, the 50,000 has been consistent all the way through. So to suggest that the artists are not donating a certain amount of
They are donating.
labor,
Yeah, they are.
I would submit is not correct.
Right.
They actually have been donated because they live with the amount of money that we have available and they make it work. And many of them work very hard to produce something that is incredible for a very low amount of money. So that's where the donation actually occurs. But I can't think of a single time that we've ever actually brought something in through this. Tax law is the driver for donated art, right? So the market value of a work of art, this, for example, was donated thanks to Butch. So, he worked with me. Our office always takes art that we think is worthy of the state collection. I do get offered, I will say to you, works of art that we don't particularly want, and graciously send them elsewhere. But it's the tax write-off, generally speaking, is what's driving people to donate, and that's always possible for government. Government is immediately a tax write-off for something, just like donating to a nonprofit or other purposes. So I don't think my hands are tied. I think, in fact, that this simplifies it. This is the amount of money we have available. This is what we get for the money. And kind of getting rid of this notion of donation is probably overdue, in my humble.
I'm going to talk to Becky because I think it's the structure, the way it's laid out. I mean, we don't want to hurt the art that's in state buildings that comes through a variety of ways. But we really need to carve out that there's a subset of this art and state buildings fund and process, which is different. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking there's confusion in the way the structure is of the statute. And maybe, because I read the powers and duties of the commissioner, it's talking about the whole state art collection. It's not just talking about the art and state buildings piece. That's the way it looks like. But I'm gonna talk to Becky. I mean, it's beyond our understanding of how statutes are put together for that. We have to close up because Phil has to get over to the pavilion because we're meeting at 12:30, but we're gonna be meeting in the pavilion. And which room is it?
270.
It's way in the back, I believe. So have folks been up to the second floor of the pavilion?
Oh, yeah.
Have you, John, been up to the second floor of the pavilion? And Wayne, all of you? So go up to the second floor of the pavilion. It's the room, I think, way in the back.
Yeah.
Pardon? I don't believe so, because this is the Housing Coalition they did this with us last year. They just talked about projects that they're in, so I don't think we have to bring anything unless you want to take notes. But that's at 12:30, and it's a joint meeting with our Senate counterparts. They decided they did not want to come up here, wanted to do it in a little larger room. Remember that when we start talking about State House expansion? And so we need to be there by 12:30. Okay, in the pavilion. Don't forget your swipe card. You know.
Yep.
And we'll go off YouTube.